Records. Okay, we're going, guys. We've only got 2 people in, but we're going to hope more people trickle in, and we are recording. So if you're watching and you think you would like to see this again or know other people who might benefit, we will get this link up on our website, YouTube page, Facebook after the event. So this is Rachel Kinder. I'm with Mission West Virginia, and this is part 2 of this webinar series. And this is April Dinwoodie. And April, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and recap our last session.
Brilliant. Rachel, thank you. And again, thanks for the patience as life brings us different things at different times. You roll with it, and you were so graceful with me in terms of rescheduling and staying committed to making the second session happen. And regardless of whether this is real time that you're watching or if you're watching it on demand at your leisure, welcome. And thank you for the time. It's always very inspiring and healing on some level for me to be in space with folks that are coming to learn and listen and center on the adopted person's voice. That is always such a big benefit, I think, to me as an individual, and hopefully I can bring you some important information that will help. I will recap a little bit more formally as I share some slides, but the last session was really, really powerful in terms of just a little bit of discussion that we had, even with some questions in the Q&A, and talking about differences of race, culture, and class, how the pandemic had given us lots of opportunities to think about things differently from that standpoint, in terms of looking at other people's experiences, a collective experience, to then create empathy for what might be happening in a transracially adopted person's system and mind, not just during the pandemic, but also throughout their life. So loved that, loved having conversations with folks. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that, because we can never talk enough about differences of race, culture, and class as it comes to adoption. But we're also going to steer into this idea of complicated relationships with extended family through adoption, both family of origin, which is my term for birth family or bio family, and family of experience, which is my term for adoptive family. So you'll hear me talk with those terms as we go, and I'll share my screen. And remember, since we are a small group, you can put in the chat questions or comments. You want me to steer into something more directly or go a little bit deeper, don't hesitate to say so in the chat. We'll make sure that we go there, because that's what we can do. So you can find me in social media. It's pretty easy to find me. I am on all the things: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I am April Dinwoodie on YouTube, but everywhere else I am June in April. So you can find me, and I welcome conversation. And you can also find my podcast on all the podcast platforms: Born in June, Raised in April, What Adoption Can Teach the World. I have a few things that sort of center me when I do this work, and I'll go through them very quickly, just as a sort of a grounding element. My belief is that adoption is not a one-time transaction. It's a lifelong journey, and that journey will have many different stops along the way, and many different ways in which we will be engaging as members of this extended family of adoption. I believe in the human rights for all humans, particularly around adoption, where I can't think of a more human experience than being born, and a more profound experience than being moved from one family to another. And I believe that everybody in that extended family has rights, but most particularly the rights to identity development and relationship belongs very much to the adopted person. And it's the grownups and the individuals who are entrusted with those children to model and drive that relationship and that real prioritization of healthy identity for children who are experiencing adoption. I also believe that obviously family of origin and family of experience have rights as well, and those rights need to be considered as we do this work in adoption today. Children are not commodities. We have a really important way in which we need to look at money and market forces in adoption, where there's a prioritization for healthy white babies in this country. There has been for a long time. And even within foster care and private adoption, there are different ways in which market forces and money do play a role in who gets services, what services are available. And we know that this is true. What a lot of this does, it impacts children in this idea of being commodified. Now, a child doesn't usually know what commodification is, but they know by the way that some things are contextualized on to ask a question like, how much did I cost? I have asked that question myself as a younger child to my parents, and I've heard that question asked. Not only that, but have heard children who are experiencing foster care talk about money and market forces. If my mom, my bio mom, had more money, she'd be able to take care of me. You get a stipend for foster parents, right? So there's a lot of talk about money that we're not having that we need to have. Adoption in America lacks uniformity. So what happens? There's different laws, policies, practices within states, counties, regions, sometimes agency to agency. Knowing what is law is important. Understanding what is policy and practice, and then making sure that that is clearly laid out for parents and professionals in order to best serve children. With a lack of uniformity, there sometimes brings confusion and chaos and leaves room and space for behavior and practices that can harm children and adults. And then the last is there'll be no reform without education. We know this, that this isn't just academic education, but this is just education as well through lived experience. So centering on the voices of those closest to the experience, adopted persons, parents, professionals that can share their wisdom is what I think will continue to make this experience even more full and whole for all involved. So those are my sort of values, the way I frame things. And then I have a few principles that I use along the way. The first is even the most vigilant eyes have blind spots. You may think you're doing all the things and getting it right, and you may be doing amazing, but there's always a spot that we might miss. So I always help to try to fill those blind spots in, or those gaps. And if there are gaps that we discover together, how can we kind of fill them up with good information? Malcolm Gladwell, if you know the book Outliers or Talking to Strangers or Blink, he has this theory that it takes 10,000 hours to be an expert. Whether you believe that theory or not, some people are trying to break that theory down and say it's hogwash. Whether you believe it or not, the idea is that we have to be in practice around the harder parts of adoption. And I think for the conventional wisdom, in a lot of ways, up until the recent past, has been about, let's not look at that. Let's just love the kids and everything will be okay. But we have to really practice being in the flow of complexity when it comes to adoption, and those relationships that are attached to it. And we won't be able to up our game and become experts if we're not leaning into that and really putting the hours in, like we're doing today, and really being in a conversation. And then the last is all parents and families are my parents and families. And what does that mean? That means that I have to give grace. And while I also share hard things and hold people accountable, as I would my own family that loves me, that I love, that raised me, that continue to be my guiding lights and my true foundation. And there are some things that could have been better. And I hope to share some of that with you today, but know that when I do, and some of those things may land on you in ways that don't feel good, know that I am holding you as I would a family member, and that same grace, that same accountability, and that same love, quite frankly, even though I don't know you. Speaking of parents and family, these are my parents. Some of you may recognize this. I'll kind of go through this, and a lot of my story can be found on my podcast if you listen in, especially the early podcasts where I didn't have guests and I just was going through a little bit of my personal narrative. I share a lot of what I share with, again, a lot of vulnerability, especially around, my parents and my family. So these are my parents. They were high school sweethearts. They married and wanted to have a family. It took them a while to get started, but they eventually had my brother, Tad. Then 11 months later, because they tried so hard to have him and it took so long, they had, of course, my brother, Jim. And then 3 years after that, they had my sister, Dawn, wanted another child. So they'd have 2 boys and 2 girls. We call that gender selection. They also knew that they could love a child based on their ability to love my brothers and sisters, and they decided to adopt. They didn't know much about adoption. They did not have a relationship to adoption other than a few folks in their extended, very broad friend group, not close in, that had adopted, and they probably had heard about it, but didn't know much about it, had no relationship to it. So they also thought, we can love any child, a child of another race, a medically fragile child. We just want a girl. So when the agency called them to say that they had a girl that could be placed in a foster to adopt situation, they jumped at the chance, and there she is. And this is one of the first pictures I have within my family of experience. But before I was in the Dinwoodie family as a foster to adopt placement, I was in foster care. And I spent several months in temporary foster care while my mother of origin decided to place me for adoption ultimately. So this is part of one of the only photos I have of me in foster care. It's my first Christmas, baby's first Christmas. But before I was in foster care, before I was placed with the Dinwoodies, I was born, and I was born to Helen June. Helen is no longer with us, and I did find her. I'll talk a little bit about this. We talk about extended family relationships and some new new experiences I've had just recently with family of origin that I can't wait to share. But Helen made the decision to relinquish me for adoption, and I did find her as a grown up, and we were not able to make a relationship. It was not in the cards. So there was a lot of emotion around that for me. But I hold pictures like this and images like this very tight in my heart, and I know that somehow or another the universe has brought me some relationship to her through the family members that I am in reunion with. So just a quick little more about extended family here as we talk about this idea of balancing family relationships and family of origin. Junebug, you see here, is my maternal grandmother. Helen June is my mother of origin, and Debbie is my half sister. And then her daughter, June. You see a theme with June. The name I was born, given the name at birth, June. And when my parents decided they were going to adopt and found out they were getting a girl that they wanted, they decided on the name April, not having known I was already June, which is why the podcast is called Born in June, Raised in April. I can talk forever about the power of names. Maybe that's another workshop related to identity and how profound it had been for me to learn that there was a name attached to me at birth that had a resonance and a meaning in my family of origin. Just this past Friday, I spent time with my extended family of origin on my birth mother's side, Helen. When she passed, she told her caregivers about another child, and her caregivers told my siblings, and my siblings found me. So I am in partial reunion with my mother's side of the family. I have still not found my father of origin, but I always hold out hope. But they had a celebration for Junebug, who is no longer with us, but it would have been her 100th birthday. And we had a family reunion, mostly virtual, but I was around some cousins, and it was so profound. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. These relationships are possible. How I wish these relationships could be manifest and nurtured earlier on in the life cycle of adoption. So, like I said, that's why everything I do is born in June, raised in April. And why I use the calendar so often as a way to break down complicated things in adoption. Every month has a theme. When we get to certain months, they're more poignant. Like when we talk about February, Black History Month, and Mother's Day and Father's Day, it gets really deep. But these are some members of my biological family that I was reintroduced to with my sister that I grew up with as well. They're in the front, and I call these people my real family because they're my real family. But I also call this my real family. This is the family I was adopted into, and this idea of real family is very important to me because if one of the families is real and one of them is not, what does that make me? We have to be very careful about the language that is used around children, especially who have been impacted by adoption, and how to give context to language and the way that it lands. Every time someone says real family to me, it really just it it lands on me, and I always try to help sort of correct that when I can. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about love and racial identity just really quickly before we get into extended family relationships. And then by the time we, get to about 12:45 or so, I will take some questions. And we'll have a conversation, and I'll address anything that makes sense. But I love starting here because I think it's so important to ground ourselves in this idea that these two things are very real when it comes to transracial adoption, but also when we talk about love, the centerpiece of adoption and what that looks like in terms of the transformational kind of love that is needed, not the transactional kind of love. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and how it extends to this idea of how we can create more more connections to family as a family that's structured by adoption. So this idea of love, for as long as I can remember, I was told that love was the reason behind all of it, that my mother of origin made a plan for me, and relinquished her rights to have a better life. And that was love. And that my parents of experience loved me so much that they wanted a family to be completed by me, and that was a driving force. So when I think about that, it was always that complication of love being so beautiful and amazing, but also having some about that backstory that I didn't quite understand. It was not enough to just say it was about love. I needed more information, age appropriately over time. So these are some of the questions that had come up, right? How could the first person that has loved me leave? How could I be so lovable yet so leavable? If my biological mother loved me so much and she left, won't everyone who loves me that much ultimately leave? And what parts of my racial identity and culture are lost, and how do I find them? So this idea of love and loss and the balance of the two things. And I'd like to center on love too, because when we think about really loving our kids, we have to extend the love not just to them, but for all that is attached to them and for the places they came from, even if those places are complex, even if those relationships and those people attached are difficult. It will help build a relationship to whole self based on some of the things that have been separated through adoption. And with that, when we're doing that work effectively and doing it from the big place of love, that racial identity can be formed because we're looking at family of origin, culture, and identity to help inform what might be useful for the children that we're entrusted with. This idea of love and loss and racial identity really is not just about that child, which is what we center on, but then what is all that is attached from a relational standpoint to that child, and how do we find room and love for that as well? So when we do this, we're looking at acknowledging the loss and the pain and thinking about how that loss and pain can impact behaviors and relationships, and knowing that it's the key ingredient, but it's not transactional, it's transformational, it's evolved, it's expansive, it's messy. And we have to talk about this idea of unconditional. We want to work towards unconditional love, but I think that is a really elevated way in which to operate in life. I think a lot of things are attached to conditions in life and love. And it's a lot, takes a lot of practice to reconstitute that for ourselves as individuals, and as members of extended family. So that's the goal, is unconditional, but it is a high bar, and it's one that takes a lot of self-reflection and work, a lot of self-love, and all of those things that we know to be true. And then if we think about prioritizing multiculturalism and anti-racism, that is also about love and racial identity, and this idea that we have to center, especially when differences of race and culture are present, on a very equitable and anti-racist way in which to operate. And it's not just about one or the other, it's both and there is a gateway to anti-racism via multiculturalism, because if you understand different cultures, you will inherently be be less apt to be biased, be less apt to be in the flow of microaggression and marginalization, even if it's unconscious. So this this idea of this transformational love and as it attached to family requires us to stretch. We have to really operate from an openness perspective, and that's openness in terms of um, uh, uh, relationship and also just access to information. We have to be open to kind of internalizing some of the harder things of family of origin and having a relationship to that. And that information has to then be translated to a child over time, age appropriately, because that lack of access to information can be ground shaking for children, not having all of those pieces and parts, shying away from secrets as much as we would tend to think it's easier to not share and talk about hard things. We have to resist the urge to keep things away from children that we believe they're not ready for, because most often it's the grown-up that's not ready. A child can really manage a lot when delivered with love and age appropriateness and in a way that will really serve them. A lot of times it's parents that aren't ready. That's just been my experience. And then you have to love yourself, right? All of this hard work means that you have to do this work, and we can't ask others to do the work we're not doing ourselves. And we've asked for so long that adopted persons, without saying the words, we've put this deep identity work on adopted persons, when a lot of the grownups and professionals aren't doing that identity work themselves. So we've got to be doing all of these things as a way to be strong enough in our own conviction, but also to model what it looks like to be a healthy individual attached to the world and in relationship to human beings and to complicated ideas. So I'm going to stop there for a second. I just want to make sure I'm going to check the chat to see if there's anything inside. Great, perfect. I just want to make sure. And please do put things in the chat if you want to investigate something more. I am going to talk a little bit more about race and culture differences, and then I'm going to steer right into identity. Matter of fact, I'm going to steer right into identity and come back to some race and culture stuff if we need to, right? Because I think I found a great spot that is going to help us kind of really dig into this idea of the importance of identity. So, as I mentioned, this idea of identity work. This is something I put through my social media because it really hit me. This is really hard work as an adopted person to sort of piece together my identity and my relationships to myself and to the world and to other people in my life. And a lot of that work I have done had been done as a solo journey. There was no guidance here, right? There was this great deal of love and the support from my family, but not a lot of conversation about what adoption and differences of race really meant to us as a family and me as an individual within that family. So what I want to shift to is the work of identity for those who are in the extended family of adoption and those particularly related to parents and professionals, and that labor that we've been asking adopted persons to do. I want that labor to be shared by grownups and parents. So when we look at this idea of digging into this is fairly new, right? This closed system. I was born and adopted within that space and time in the early 70s, where the conventional wisdom was to keep things secret, right? We'll talk a little bit about the history and why I put the context around history is that we are now in a space and time we talk a lot about openness and we just should be all one big happy family, but okay, that's hard. So I want to also create the a little bit of the timeline around this, because this is not something we're conditioned to over hundreds of years to be in the flow of. This is new and different, and we're still and very much in the figuring it out years. So i- what we know today is that it's very common, and even more common given kind of some of the innovations we have in our life at our fingertips around DNA exploration, around social media and connectivity. Um, they're not only common questions about who am I, but now we have a different kind of permission about really looking at ourselves and our identity and sharing this through social media, whether you are a fan of that or not. But we have this like real kind of trend in investigating ourselves. So when we think of a closed system, it made some of these like very foundational and fundamental questions really difficult, right? Who am I? Like, why was I adopted? Who do I look like? Do I have siblings? How did I get here? Why was I placed for adoption? Is there something shameful about my origins? Why aren't we talking about them? Is anyone looking for me? And should I search? All of these things. I've thought of all of these things a number of times. And it's not just from my personal standpoint, because I'm one person in a very large community of folks who are impacted by adoption. But I've done so much work with young people, both in foster care, young people who have been adopted privately, through domestic adoption, through intercountry adoption, across all kinds of cultures and family structures. And these questions are like from all of us at different points in time. So within the closed system, it makes these common questions that you would just assume would come up in adoption almost impossible to answer if we're not on openness, right? So healthy adoption identity is the kind of the first place that we start with this. So how did we get to this place of um, what I was being told by grown-ups and kind of what that led to in terms of questions and confusion? She loved you so much. Yes, I felt that, but won't everybody leave if that's what love is? You're so lucky you're adopted, but will I ever be grateful enough, right? Like for what has been so profoundly impacted my life through my family. Where are your real parents? We talked about this. Am I real? Were you in an orphanage? I think an orphanage, and I think that parents have died, right? Not all children who are in the in the experience of adoption or foster care, parents die. That's sometimes the case, but not always. And orphanages are very rare these days, but they do exist. So that got me thinking, because people just automatically hear adoption. I think you were in an orphanage, like little orphan Annie. uh, where are you from? This idea of the question of like, you don't belong here, like kind of the weird looks, and do I belong? Am I weird? Is that your girlfriend? Yes, people have asked that about my dad and my brothers, because we do not match and we are in a close proximity, and maybe have our arm around each other. That's a weird one, and it gets me thinking, like, should I not hug my dad in public? Is what will the optics be here? And then being teased about being adopted, about not being wanted as a young person, as a kid. So when you think about building healthy identity, a lot of these things need to be part of this, right? In terms of recognizing the grief and loss, helping children heal their grief, right? In doing that by healing your grief first, because there's grief and loss and adoption for everyone. And then when we're centering on that, we can help kids and children with theirs. Manage the complexity and the discomfort and this insecurities you may have as a parent. And this comes into play particularly around extended family, right? Both in your family of experience and in the family of origin. As parents, if you are feeling insecure about these your place in the relationship, right? Will she love me enough if she knows her mother of origin? That's operating from a place of fear, and that gets really challenging for the child to negotiate that. Because if, let's say, we want to know more about our mother or father of origin, or our parents who brought us into the world, or extended families, or even if, heck, we want to know if we have brothers and sisters, if we see you being discomforted by that, or see you being insecure, or see you reacting to things in a way um, that might impact our interest and our holding of being able to ask the questions. So it doesn't mean you don't have to hide emotion and be, completely devoid of emotion, because this is emotional stuff. But what is it about where you are that may be kind of projecting out into the space. So a child might feel just not a welcome of this conversation. So all these things need to be kind of looked at. We have to think about the inappropriate questions and treatment from inside our family and our community, and with professionals and strangers. This is a really an interesting thing to think about, because oftentimes we're focused on our close-in family, just the people that are with us every day, but family extends to grandparents, aunties, uncles, people who are like family, who are like fictive kin, people we feel an attachment like family to, that may have very different understandings of adoption and holding, and they may ask questions that feel inappropriate. They may be treating different children in different situations. You may have a bio kid and an adopted kid, and some families may treat one different than the other. There may be differences of race where there is some bias and some microaggression happening to the child of color in the family. These things, we must be prepared for these things, and we must be sort of in the flow and the practice of being engaged in some of those difficult conversations. So educating yourself on the both and of adoption, that is also a part of educating others. Like, yes, adoption is both beautiful and it's also hard. And there could be times when we're wanting to celebrate and look at our family, it's so amazing. And then we may want to resist the urge to do that if a child may not be in that same celebratory place. There's a lot of both and in adoption. Obtain as much information and narrative as possible about family of origin. These are facts, right? Let's just say you didn't get as many facts as you would hope to have gotten at the beginning of your adoption journey with family of origin. There's always an opportunity to find something out, even if it's with an extended family member. We have had situations where, in the most profound of separations of families, there was a child who was left and abandoned, and the child who was in one of my mentoring programs was so curious about their life before they were found and before they were in foster care and then ultimately adopted. We found the police officer who found them and reconnected that. Now, that is like a unique and very powerful and profound moment, but there was a lot of healing that occurred in just knowing the person who found this individual. So that's extreme. We don't always have situations where it's like almost no information can be found, but there always is an opportunity to dig a little bit more to get that information. And a lot of parents will say, well, I don't want to do that because my kid hasn't asked, or I'll ask when they're ready, I'll do it. You don't want to wait until they're ready, because then you're going to be drinking out of the fire hose. Get as much information as you can now. Keep it safe, keep it secure, because adopted kids have big ears and we can be nosy. So we may go looking for things. I know almost every kid I talk to has gone to look for information somewhere, and most have found information, and it doesn't go well. So you don't want your kid to be finding information about themselves without you. You also don't want to hold back too much information, and go at the pace that would be right for your kid, because you know your kid best. Obviously, when we get into some of these other things about adoption related jokes, we just obviously cannot tolerate those. I can't believe I have to say that sometimes, but sometimes people do, and that is problematic. It create more of a community of adoption around your family, like in things like this, like if with organizations that can really attach you to other families that may be in the same boat. Oh my gosh, you're navigating family of origin too. It's so hard. Create that soft place, create that place of learning and understanding, right? Education isn't always about academic and reading. It's about a conversation with someone who are in the same boat as you. And you just get that validation of like, wow, yeah, I'm going to keep on my path, or I need to do something different and better. Anticipate and prepare for questions and confusion from a child, from those around you that may not understand. And then also recognize, right, what might activate emotion. Sometimes lesson plans in school, sometimes the family tree, sometimes family functions. Sometimes this idea of adopt a highway, adoption talk of animals can activate some kids, and adoption narratives in TVs and movies. For those who haven't already seen, I'm not going to give it away, but if you have an adopted child in your family, Cruella is a really interesting movie, but it has a lot of themes of adoption and abandonment and the truth embedded into it. So I highly recommend listening to some reviews and or reading some reviews, and maybe even watching it first before you watch with your child, so that you can have a conversation about it. Oopsies.
April.
Yes.
I was just going to point something out that based on your last session, we had discussed children overhearing you talk about their family of origin. And as an adoptive mom, 6 years in, we talk about my son's, we call her his first mom. And before talking to you, in my head, it was very intentional. Anytime we talked about it, it was a very serious, intentional moment I had with him. And if I needed to say something to my husband about my son's birth parents, I would whisper it or say it when my son wasn't around. Or really what you shared the last time really made me think about how kind of crazy that was. That this doesn't have to be a deep, profound conversation every time we talk about her. And that's really helped me. So I just wanted to share that.
Well, I appreciate you for that, Rachel, because what I've learned to be true is that, and it came later because I've reflected back on some of this stuff based on a family experience that happened. There was a family that was being fostered by my aunt's friend, and we were at a barbecue, and these children were sort of milling around. It was a big backyard, and my aunt came to me and did one of those, oh, that family, if there's adoption in our midst anywhere, people feel it's important to share with me. And I love that. That's cool. I like that. But my aunt came and said, oh, there's a family here that are fostering kids, and, their mother is addicted to blah, blah, blah. And she's kind of covering, and she's doing this thing. And I saw one of the little girls from way over in the field. Her head pops up and she looks right at us. No sooner, a little later on, I'm getting some food in the line. That little girl is right by my leg. And she looked at me and she said, do you know me? I said, my aunt was actually telling me a little bit about you, but no, I don't know you. What's your name? And it was, my name is such and such. And, I really like that. Like the mule over there is really cool. And what, but she knew. She knew someone was talking about her. And kids know, they don't always have the language or the ability to articulate what they're feeling or what their instincts are. But as you get older, as I got older, and that experience made me think about all the times that I felt that way, that someone was talking about me or my situation, but leaving me out of it. And it wasn't a benefit to me, right, in the end. So I appreciate you for bringing that back up, and it's something that doesn't always happen, but someone told me at some point, and I use it, and I can't remember the person. They said, adopted kids have big ears. I'm like, yes, we do. We are constantly waiting and looking for some kind of a clue about something, especially if we're not having conversations more actively around this. So I'm going to share my screen again, and let's see here, jump back in. Here we go. So I want to dig into, let me start here because I love this, and I'm going to be highlighting this podcast soon. This is Daryl McDaniel's DMC of Run DMC for those hip hop heads out there. Dating myself, this was like, my jam. And who knew that I would have my younger self's hero in my midst and have share this experience of adoption. At the time where when I was listening to his music, he didn't know he was adopted, and neither did I know that he was adopted. But he found out he was adopted at 35. And he says, very simply, you cannot start a book on chapter 2. You have to start at chapter 1. And I just found that so profound. And when we are adopting with this idea of amputating what happened before and grafting newness onto what's happening now, it really is. It's like starting at chapter 2. What happened chapter 1? We missed that whole thing. And even the hardest circumstances, I think, need to be negotiated in terms of the balance of the why. Because what I remember, and I hear a lot about when I work with children who have been adopted, younger kids, they always want to know why. When they come into a group setting with other kids who are adopted that I facilitate in schools, a lot of the first conversation is, why were you adopted? Either and some kids know their why and some kids don't, or some kids think they know their why. And it's always very interesting to hear a kid say their why. I think some parents would be profoundly um, motivated to be in more transparent conversation when they hear their kid say their why they think they were adopted. So always trying to encourage that. So, hold on, let's see. So here we go. So I'm going to steer into a little bit of like just foundational research, and then we can talk. And please put questions in the chat because I'm really willing and able to answer anything. But I wanted to kind of give us a firm base of research that has been done over time. There's something called the MTARP study, the Minnesota Texas adoption. Study. Gosh, it's called MTARP. Rachel, I can get this to you. It's a longitudinal study about openness and adoption. And that's one study. This is research that was done by Siegel and Smith in 2012 about the benefits of openness and open adoption for all family members. So these are general facts from that research. So, and I want to be careful about open adoption and openness and adoption. I believe they're a little bit two different things. And so I definitely feel like you can center on openness always, regardless of the adoption type. Open adoption is not for everyone, but what we know from research and lived experience is that it's beneficial for all members, birth and adoptive. It requires collaboration for all family members, right? And it requires a high level of relationship skill that is sometimes needed to be modeled by one family over another. Depending on people's where they are. If family of origin has had trauma in their life, there may be some relationship skills that aren't present that a family who is adopting, who maybe hasn't had as much trauma or resource deprivation or other things that are in their life as reality, may have different kinds of relationship skills. We always center on child-focused agreements. Something I talk about in terms of the competing interests of adults and how they can be harmful to children. How do we know this? We can look at adoption and look at family of origin versus family of experience and how, the court systems sometimes create that kind of dynamic. But we could also look at this when it comes to custody and divorce and remarriage, where, parents are in that flow of competing interests, and it harms children. So we have evidence, not just in adoption, but in other parts of our lives in relationship to family and to taking care of children, where we're not focusing on children, we're focusing on our needs as adults in a negative way. So we really have to recenter and say, okay, this is about the kids. How do we elevate so that we can be in better service of the children? And then open adoption does not negatively impact a child's behavioral adjustment. And it may actually, in some cases, really ease some adolescent transitions. And what do I mean by that? When a child is starting to really develop into that phase of identity around adolescence, where there are some really serious questions that are being asked in terms of who am I? If the pieces and parts aren't there to steer into, it can have a really negative effect on their well-being and on their mental health and on their path forward. What has also been a fact of in reality has been that, for instance, when you look at inter-country adoption, what we saw in a Beyond Culture Camp, it's a study, Beyond Culture Camp, that looked at adoption from in other countries, and the reason why a lot of parents went to other countries is because they would not have to deal with, in their words, a family of origin. And then right around adolescence, when their teen or their tween was asking questions and really having some identity crisis, if you will, the parents were beside themselves because they had no information. And they really were contrite and thinking, my gosh, we really just did not even dig into any of this. And now we really need things that we don't have access to. So it was just a word of sort of caution there. A little bit more on openness today. Regardless of type, it feels like it's part of adoption today. The market, if you will, has changed. We have parents of origin making different decisions based on wanting connection to their child, to the family over time. That's not always the case, but it can be, and that changes the way that adoption agencies need to do their work. So 95% of agents today do offer some form of open adoption. And it's different, what the definition of open adoption is. To some it's cards and letters once a year, to some it's we have holiday meals together, to some, believe it or not, open adoption is a caregiver, a child care provider. Birth mother is the child care provider, but the child does not know, but the parents think that they're in an open adoption. That's real. That's so open adoption can be defined in many different ways. And each can provide their own set of challenges, right? Depending on the type of adoption. Oftentimes, when a child has been removed due to abuse and neglect, there can be real challenges in theory engaging family of origin, because there has been a removal or a TPR, termination of parental rights. But that doesn't mean that terminates the relationship to extended family. I think regardless of the situation in a family of origin, there can almost always be one emotionally and psychologically safe individual that can be in relationship to the child. We have to protect children first and foremost. So if it is unhealthy and it's unsafe, then we wouldn't do that. But we could always even have conversations about family of origin and openness. So even if there aren't relationships, we can be open to having conversations. And given where we are in the world of people finding each other through DNA and through social media, oftentimes it's not an if, it's a when. A child's going to be curious and go and look. So we have to prepare for that reality and that eventuality that we live in today in modern society. And with that, we talk about what best practice says. Openness is about a basic human right of a child to be connected with all the information that belongs to them. Getting their original birth certificate. That is really, we're the only class of persons in this country and most states, except for Kansas and Alaska, where our birth certificates are sealed when we are adopted and a new certificate is created. It can be, again, we go back to the both and. I can both have parents who are parenting me legally and having that be a legal document that is important to me in the way I have to move through systems in the world. And I could also have a document that talks about my parentage and where I'm from and my roots. Both can be true. Both can be live in the same space at the same time. We really need to figure out how to do that better, because with that as the starting place, I think it's the general tendency, if we do that, right, with birth certificates, if we take one off and put one on, and then we leave it that transaction, it really does set us up for like, oh, that doesn't matter. So we really have to be careful. And then the last piece of this is within modern society, as I've been saying, openness happens whether we like it or not. So we better be ready. We can't leave it to the last minute or when something has been unearthed when we want to steer into this. It's coming in, and more young people are clear that there are ways to find, and more of us as adopted persons are sharing our narrative. So I'm a little bit more on research, then we get into some more relational pieces, and I'll take some questions if you have them. Openness is found actually to increase the understanding and enhance communication between parents and children. Makes sense, right? If you're more open, if there's more of a normalization of a conversation that is open, and that, let's just say, when we talk about that idea of kids having big ears, if we are just in the flow of being open about conversation and also private when it makes sense, to protect kids and their information. But if we're just a family that talks about these things, it's not weird, or it's not pathologizing to be kind of in that flow of communication. So it increases, obviously, in any type of relationship, and openness increases that communication between parents and children. It's just that's a fact. one size does not fit all in any of this. And that can be a, in the lexicon is like, oh, that's a throwaway thing to say, but it's true. And I don't know any more complicated and intricate relationship work than that of adoption, and family of origin and family of experience. So you really do have to figure out what works for you, and what works for you today may not work for you as a group down the line. Life happens, pandemics happen, life milestones move and ebb and flow. So these relationships will as well. Flexibility, obviously, always important. Like any relationships, they change over time. And these little things in the blue area, reducing our fears will help, right? Like we get less activated when we're confident. If we're not confident and we're not centered on a place of a strong foundation, this will be very difficult, and it will be very hard, and it will be painful for everyone. So fear is normal, but when we have facts next to that, it's like knowledge is power, right? The more we can learn about openness and practice it, the less we'll be afraid of it. I just think that's the case. And try some things. I mean, when I think about some advice I've given to parents during the pandemic, if let's say you're not in touch, or you haven't been in touch, or you've lost touch, or you just didn't know how to even be in touch with anybody in extended family, now is a great time coming out of a pandemic. How did you make out? How are you? The other just really basic thing is, has anyone passed? Has anyone left the planet? You want to know these things. You don't want to, in these later years of what many of us in the closed era of adoption have had to encounter, is people not being with us any longer, having left the planet. So I can't stress enough the importance of having that knowledge and staying in touch, even if you're not in relationship, and not to stalk or be inappropriate, but to know where folks are, so that when that desire might come about, and you've got the right supports in place for yourself and your family and your children, you'll have the information there. You'll at least be one step closer to this knowledge and this important information that may be that may be desired. So how did we get here, right? The, it, Before the early 1920s and 30s, adoption was largely unregulated. We had the orphan train movement, where poor children were sent from urban environments to work on families, with families on farms. There was almost little to no oversight of the practice. A change in beliefs about child welfare and development, and a controversy around these orphan trains began the professionalization of these services. And that really is what led to today's modern day child welfare system. But for a long time, there was not a lot of regulation, and this is not that long ago. So until the mid 20th century, adoption was not as popular as a family building option. Then it became as such in the early 20th century, where people started to value nature over nurture. I think it's a both and. That's just my opinion. But this also, we think about openness, right? And we think about complicated relationships to things and realities. We also think about how things have changed for women and families, with birth control and all of things, and thinking about single motherhood, unwed mothers, and how that stigma was real and still can find that today. So there have been some real societal challenges and changes that have impacted adoption over time. As adoption becomes popular in the middle of the century, people see it more as an option. We did really think that children came to us with a blank slate, and that we didn't need to worry about nature. It was all about nurture. And then that we're in that idea of a child needed two heterosexual parents, a man and a woman, to raise them. We know that study after study shows that it's okay to have one parent. It's okay to have two parents who are the same sex. We know that there can be challenges within any family, but that these American ideals have shifted over time. And I will just say this too, that doesn't mean that traditional family of a man and a woman as husband and wife, raising children is a bad thing. It just means that we have to meet the moment in terms of where we are with family structure. Um, and to just cap off this little section, there's a great emphasis on keeping adoption secret for many years. And some families went as far as to feign pregnancy and put pillows underneath a woman's um, dresses to act as if they were part of the family biologically. There was a lot of secrecy and shame. And again, this was not that long ago. So we are moving in a very interesting trajectory, and the expectations are high when we haven't had a lot of practice and a lot of support from the professional community on these relationships. So we really have to kind of remember where we are and know that there's an urgency around creating these family relationships and these relationships and to adoption and being more open, but that this is going to take some time. Is in the mid 20th century, these differences were denied, and actually professionals sought to match families. That was very much the case of trying to make sure people looked alike, so that there would not be any sense that there was any difference in biological relation. People were choosing this is the happy story of adoption. You were chosen, lucky, grateful. We now know that adoption can come with some real challenges, and while there's joy, there is both can be some loss and grief and pain and trauma that we need to address. Adoption was thought to have no impact on identity development. And we know now today that that is just not true. And it doesn't just impact a child's identity development. I think our identity as grown-ups and as parents through adoption changes our identity as well. And that also has to be part of the dialogue today. And as we look at things and meet the moment, and adoption searching for family of origin was often pathologized, and often seen as something must be wrong with you if you are not happy and satisfied with the family that has adopted you. Today, we're in a different place in terms of the realities. Not all systems and parents and professionals have caught up. We know this is why we have these conversations. Today, we are celebrating differences in different ways, and they're acknowledged. Just we can't live in that color evasive place of just, oh, we don't see the differences. There are differences, and that's okay. We can work with that, and maybe even be more elevated and more connected within that. Staying in contact with birth family members is normal. This is something that we know. When you think about family separation these days and how we've been very impacted by the pandemic and those relationships that we so hold dear, and how that's hurt to not be around family, to know they're there but not have contact with them. It couldn't be a bigger, broader, more impactful message around why it's critically important that we lean into this idea of it hurts when you're separated from people, even if there has been a brief relationship. And in an utero relationship, that separation is impactful. It's important, and we need to acknowledge that those connections can be kept at any point in any stage, even if it's a connection to the idea. We can have these conversations without being in real time relationship to folks because of death or safety, but we can be in conversation about it. That's a big, broad headline. We know now adoption is thought to be critical to identity development. And this modern family, this the blended and diverse families are more the norm than they were and continue to be. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these questions of who am I, and I'll take it back to me for a second. As a kid, you can see me there. I'm sure I wasn't formulating these questions in language, but I was certainly thinking them over time. Where did I come from? How did I get here? Who are these people? And why are they all so white? There was a lot of fantasy that was going on in my brain, from thinking people were my birth family, celebrities on TV, Harry Belafonte and Bewitched, dating myself, but people that I saw on TV, I would think, oh, they're my family, right? Because they might be able to kind of resemble me in a certain kind of way. But with the lack of conversation and real attention to this unique experience with all these people around me that clearly didn't look like me, and but I was attached to as a family, it really created a lot of chaos and a lot of things that needed to be addressed, that I had to address later in life, that I wish I could have addressed sooner. So I don't know if any of you know this, but Eric Erickson, who is the father of the identity crisis, right? He's a German American developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst, known for his theory on psychological development of human beings, and he is known to have coined the phrase identity crisis. Eric named himself. If you notice Eric Erickson, he was not named the last name Erickson. He gave that to himself because he had a separation from his father of origin and did not, and he was fathered by someone who was not his biological father and didn't know that until later in life, and talks very openly in some of his writings, and his daughter speaks of this too, that identity crisis really came to be because of that separation that he had, and it really impacted him, so much so that he chose his name. He named himself as a grown-up. And I just think that is so profound and how it impacts us. And we think about this idea of who am I in adoption. And like I said, this is my friend Joyce McGuire Pavo, who was on my podcast. She was like, she would ask direct questions about adoption, and the answer would always be, could you pass the broccoli, please? But what was happening, same in my family, we didn't talk about it, right? But there were conversations, and there were those conversations that I sort of overheard or felt in my body, but didn't really, they weren't directed towards me. They were in other ways. So important to kind of go back to that too and think about that. Just taking the time here, I'll leave some time at the end for some questions. So, okay, so the identity, adoption and identity impact, right? It impacts our identity development in many ways, right? And especially when we talk about gaps of information. My therapist, who I love dearly, says to me, April, you have a piece of information, then a gap, big gap, then another piece of information, and then a gap. And gaps attract attention. So our attention will sometimes go to the places where we don't have that information, and that can become very difficult. Talk about going down the rabbit hole. So that's important to think about those gaps in identity formation that are created by adoption oftentimes. There was a study from the Donaldson Adoption Institute. This is the Beyond Culture Camp one that I was speaking about before as well, where 80% of Korean adopted persons and 70% of Caucasian adopted persons rated their identity as an adopted person as important or very important during young adulthood. So, and even sometimes more important than their racial identity, their adoption identity is there, and it's kind of the steady drumbeat of this question of who am I related to adoption in my family structure, and one that hasn't really been discussed in a way as obviously as differences of race has. So sometimes this adoption identity, this identity of adoption, isn't spoken about as openly as sometimes the obvious things are, which is differences of race and culture. It's important that we normalize the worries and the concerns that might come up, right? It's normal that people want to know where they came from. And it's normal that people want to know who they're biologically connected to. This has been evidenced in the trend around DNA and Ancestry.com and all of the millions of people who are going onto these sites and learning about where they're from. It is a national pastime for those who can afford the $99 in the memberships. It has become something that has been normalized in our society, even more so today. So I love that. In a way, I don't love the fees attached to some of this, especially for adopted persons. I think any adopted person should get that free. I think we should all get free DNA kits when we're adopted, because we deserve to know. Other normal worries, the absence of facts. And like I said, kids will often fantasize about the missing pieces of their lives. I know I did. I made it up. I told stories. There was a really interesting story about a parent who was really frustrated with his young adult child. His whole life, this young adult child was prone to lying, big lies and little lies. And it was really weighing heavily on this dad. And he's also someone who I know, they don't speak about adoption very much at all in their family. And, very much a missed opportunity there. But what I pointed out to this dad was that when you have centered on essentially not giving all the facts and not being completely truthful with kids about their family of origin, why would we suspect that they would not lie about other things or take that on in their identity? Um, I said, we have to really look at these things in an intricate way. And he was sort of blown away by that, there wasn't an honest holding of the experience of adoption. And I think from there came a lot of other ways in which that impacted this young man's identity and his propensity to lie and not tell the truth about things. I can't be sure. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I'm guessing that some of the realities have impacted his behavior and his bending of the truth, given his lack of truth in his reality of his life. So, some other things to think about: discounting fears of being born before being adopted can lead to very isolating feeling, right? Like I said, you can't start a book at chapter 2, as DMC said. And when we think about it, everybody who is not adopted in some way tends to have their being born story, right? And there's something that comes with that narrative and that reality of having a witness to your birth. And some people, some parents are in the delivery room with adoption, but there's so much about that idea of acknowledging that something came before that's powerful in adoption. Some more about what research might tell us. Openness allows an adopted person to have more information about their complete history. Pretty simple, right? Adopted persons can experience greater satisfaction with adoption when openness is involved. When I was at Donaldson Adoption Institute, we did one of the biggest public opinion surveys, 2,000 people across the country, with a subset of adopted persons, birth parents, adoptive parents, and foster parents and former foster youth. One of the more one of the questions that a lot of adopted persons agreed on was that if they were in open adoptions, that there was a greater satisfaction with the experience of adoption. There was a more settled nature of relationship to adoption when there was a greater sense of openness. Adopted persons do not experience confusion about parental roles when adoption was involved. This is a really big one, right? Won't they be confused? I know a lot of families in open adoptions, and kids are rarely, if ever, confused. When parents are confident and clear, and when parents are not competing, when parents are in a very good flow, it's kids are very clear who's taking care of them and meeting their needs in specific ways. And it is true that parents can meet different needs in children, both birth and adoptive parents, right? They can meet different needs for a child. It doesn't mean that this is a co-parenting situation. In some cases it is, in a lot of cases it isn't, but kids know whose role, uh, who's playing what role. And oftentimes they'll tell you that by who they call what to. And there's who's to say that someone can't have a mother and a mom? Who's to say that we can't have 2 or 3 moms mothering us? This is about this idea of like this expanded view of family. This not this ownership of this is just for me and us. It also again isn't this co-parenting relationship generally, right? There's a clear sense of who is in charge, but there is a relationship between those parental roles, and the more we can kind of lean into and looking at what works for you and your family, the better the child will be and the more settled it will be there. Mm. Often when an adopted person is dissatisfied with openness arrangement, it's because they desire more contact, not less. So that is one thing that has come from this piece of research. With appropriate collaboration between first birth and adoptive families, children in open adoptions can experience healthier adjustment all around. So some benefits, right? We've talked about this, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. When you're open, you're having these conversations with whatever information you have and whatever connectivity they have, kids have a touchstone for things. And physical traits is really powerful, right? Having a sense of, where did I get why are my hands this way? Why do I have a gap in my teeth? That mirroring of physical characteristics and traits is really profoundly powerful. When you're looking around that Thanksgiving Day table and you don't see faces that look like yours, it can be very, very dramatic. And And on top of it, when we're not acknowledging those differences, we're just supposed to fit in and assimilate. That can be really, really hard. So we think about some of those dynamics, those extended family dynamics, and how we can have touch tones when there is openness. And that also makes it imperative that as you're gathering up information, it's not just about maybe medical health history. Um, it's also about the things that make your children's bio parents them, from physical characteristics to, were they good at playing basketball? Did they sing in the church choir? Were they a really good cook? What are some of the things that are part of that person's life, even if there are hard things? Because both can be true. You could do some things that require uh, some changes in your life, uh, and you can still be really good at stuff too. So I like the both end of that, because if only the challenging things and the things that are hard are attached to your children's family that they're attached to, they will internalize most definitely those difficult things. Will I be like that? So if we don't have a balance of the things, that will be challenging to negotiate from an identity standpoint. Openness allows adopted persons to better integrate aspects of their identity into their life and their experience, right? All the things. Some of the cautions that we need to put in place around maybe some medical health history, some addiction history and legacy. These things we need to know, but also some of the things that are different and unique and cool. They can live together in the same place. And then openness creates a wider support system for adopted persons. Look, never too many people to love, or to love me, is my motto, and I believe that when you move in that flow, it's adding, not subtracting. It's bringing people in, not extracting people. All of that is about an elevated way to experience family and adoption today. So here are some things we can do. Oh, I got to go back. That was too quick. Reflect on how much and or how complicated family connections are for you. Let's start with, take adoption out of it for a second. Um, think about the complicated family dynamics you have without adoption, with your family that you were raised with your mom and dad, with your extended family members. Every family has their complexity. Start with that first. What is your relationship to some of that complexity? How does that relationship and how you've navigated it impact your relationship that you have to your children and their extended families, right? Um, Remember, it is a family affair. It's extended family. It's not just the family that lives with you day in and day out. It's people that you come together with with regularity, and even some that don't come in with regularity, but that they sometimes need to have some context for this too, so that there is a sense of how you are behaving as a family, what you talk about, what is and isn't off limits, how we hold complexity in terms of and privacy in terms of our family makeup. Seeking support groups. Gosh, I can't say this enough, that having that community of professionals and other families around you, um, and mental health professionals that are adoption competent, understanding the dynamics of extended family through adoption, and then coaches, people like me who do this kind of work and can help, not as a mental health professional. I know a lot of them though, and a lot of good ones, but more to help you navigate some of this and help you kind of step back and say, oh, right, like, this is a relationship skill I have already. I know how to be in relationship with someone who's not biologically related to me because I understand in-laws, or I have a family friend who is like a sister to me. And I work at that relationship, even though we're very different. I work at that relationship because I love her. Or I work at that relationship with my in laws because I love my partner. And I know that even though they're not exactly how I would like them to be, or I don't like to go to that weird place they like to go to every Christmas, I do it because I love my partner and I want to be in a full and whole relationship with them. Some other pieces we talked about, organizing the facts, right? Um, Keep file folders, like put different pieces of information in. If you, once a year, you check in on Facebook, you find out where some folks are, you figure out some new information, archive it, codify it, make copies, keep it safe. Sometimes those pieces of paper are the only attachment we have to our family of origin. The pieces of paper I have, I'm looking for some now, I'm not at home, so I don't have them, but they're like, that's like it's like gold to me. It's like gold. And sometimes, again, that's the only relationship we might have to family of origin. So please keep those facts, those papers organized, and treat them as you would anything that you would put in a safe deposit box, right? And not to hide or protect or keep secret, but to keep safe. Internalize all these facts first about this complicated relationship. Process your emotions, and before you help your child with theirs, right? Like if you're coming from a place of fear, if you have not organized yourself and your emotions around this relationship, you are not going to serve your child there. They have to see you modeling what it looks like. So let's just say this. Let's say you have a relationship with family of origin. And let's say little Joey doesn't want to go and see um, his mother of origin that day. You go have coffee. Say, hey, Joey didn't feel like coming today, but is it okay? I'm going to come. I have a piece of artwork from his last week at school. I might want to show it to you. It isn't always um, for the child, doesn't always mean you're taking or dragging the kid with you. These relationships, first and foremost, are for you to have. You have to have a healthy relationship first, because you have to talk about boundaries. You have to talk about what you're going to do on, like, is it okay to post pictures on social media? All these things are going to come up. And if you don't address them beforehand, you put some scaffolding and guardrails around it, they will come up, and it will be doing it in real time, and sometimes in a crisis moment. We don't want that. We want to be ready for that. And then really practice talking to your child about the realities of adoption and the impact. This starts really young too. I don't know the ages of your children that you may be working with, but and entrusted with, but it's important that you can practice these things when a kid is really young. And especially if they're babies, I always say, like, talk about the hard things to babies, not negative language of just, this is what happened, right? Because the more you get comfortable, sometimes you need to do a role play with a trusted adult, a partner, because you have to get good with addressing some of these conversations. Like, also not without emotion, because some of these conversations are emotional, but if you're so activated in your emotion and you can't have the conversation rationally and reasonably with a child, then it's time for you to go back and do a little bit more work about that. And then stay connected. Resist the urge to pull away, right? Which sometimes can happen. Like something goes down in your family or their family, and just like, I'm done. I'm finished with this. Resist the urge to pull away. You may need to take a break or reconstitute something, but resist the urge to completely sever that. And even if a birth family has, that happens a lot. Like a birth family will say, "Look, can't do it," and they may ghost, as we use in modern language. Stay with it and don't push, but over time, drop a note. Hey, I just checking on you. That's it. No more, no less, right? To keep some of that heartbeat, that drumbeat going. And last, realize that the world is changing. We have to keep up, right? So we know that there are ways to find people. And if we're not careful, children, and we're not open, children, teens, young people, young adults may be doing some of this relationship connectivity without your knowing. I've heard that often. It can be very dangerous, and it happens a lot. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop my screen share and look in the chat real quick. To see if there's anything. I don't see anything here, but I want to open it up for any questions. And Rachel, maybe you have heard something that has given you something to ask before we close out. I know I put a lot out on the table, but I hope it was, that balance of like of facts and research to like lived experience and some tips that can really help kind of foster more of these relationships.
Yeah, I have 3 pages of notes I've taken during this. So I'll just start with one question. Hopefully other people will join in. I know sometimes people get shy. So my personal perspective, 2 young kids, one by birth, one by adoption. So the sibling rivalry is real and probably more intense than for maybe some other families on here. But, fairness is very big for my kids right now. And any tips on balancing, that you love my sister more than me, you love my brother more than me, that was not fair, that I think happens with every sibling relationship, but is maybe gets more intense in a blended family.
No question. It's a great question. And it's a really delicate one. I will say there's a podcast of my mom, one of the first podcasts that I did with her, that when I listened back to it, and at the time I almost cried when I heard it, because it speaks exactly to this. And again, I always say, like, my mother is the most amazing human being on the planet. And the shape and size of her heart is why I can do what I do, because she's everything to me. But in this conversation we had, there was some sibling moment going on with my sister, my older sister. And I said, well, mom, how come Dawn can do that and I can't? Or how come she gets that and I can't? And my mom said, and she recounted it on the podcast, because I love her more. My heart shattered into a million pieces, right? Because even in the moment where there may appear to be an equitable exchange over top of our experiences as kids, right? Which, by the way, every kid doesn't need the same thing. Some kids need different things in a family of biology. So to think that there's one dimension and one delivery system for parenting is just is not realistic. It's very true when you talk about adoption. So fast forward, right? Like, I know that she loves us. She loves us. She does love us differently. And that's okay. So how I would, if the little April, what little April would have needed, right, in a sibling rivalry moment, was certainly not what my mother said, right? And if it was happening again, April, I can understand how you might think that. Coming from where you are coming from, entering the family as you did, being a little bit different, right? Looking different, having a different family that you're attached to. I can understand how you might think that there might be a difference here. But that's not the case. Like, I am doing this in a way that works for me and you really in the long run. And really just, but like acknowledging for even a second that it might indeed feel that way. And it might be true in their eyes. And the reverse is true. My sister and my brothers would say this too, that I got different preferential treatment, right? Because I was the kid who needed, because I was the kid who needed or demanded a little bit of different kind of support and attention. And what I would say for all of that is, I never wanted any of it. Like, I never wanted any of it. If I, not, I didn't make the decision to be relinquished. I didn't make the decision to be adopted. I'm here. I got here because two grownups decided that I was going to be part of this family. And yes, I stick out. Sometimes my behaviors are different because I'm deep in trauma that no one's recognizing. I am really trying to negotiate this wacky life that no one's talking about. So yeah, I'm going to throw something sometimes. I'm going to be a little bit extra aggressive. I need you to hold me in that. I need you to sit and hold me. And maybe you need to hold us both. Sometimes maybe one, but it's tricky, but I'll tell you just in that little vignette, what not to do. Right. And that's hard, but I do think that's so real, and it's so underappreciated, Rachel, in the work that we're doing to prepare families. It's transactionally discussed. Oh, little Jimmy's so excited to have a big sister or a little sister. Or, yay, it's so exciting, but that's where it ends.
Makes sense. I think we have, thank you. Someone has raised their hand. Let me see if I can let them allow to talk. Gina, did you have a question? I'm asking her to unmute because she's muted. And then sometimes I think people bump that button. So,
yep.
Okay, we'll see if we can get this question here.
Cool.
Okay. Something's not working here. She might have raised her hands accidentally.
Cool.
If anyone else has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Or April is such a wealth of information. I'm going to keep picking her brain here. Okay, so question, most of our families we work with have adopted through Child Protective Services, foster care. Not every backstory is ideal. But when you were talking about getting that information and hanging on to it for the kids for when they need it or want it or are ready for it. What if the only picture you can get for a parent of origin is a mugshot? Because I've had that question before.
What about there's so many people who are artists today, What about having an artist do a rendering or
Mm.
some kind of a drawing or a painting of the photograph in a different setting? I think that that would be a nice way to at least bring in an image. Um, and as life goes on, if that is you know, again, the only picture that you can have, there's a way to also share a picture like that. Age appropriately in the right context and framing. But I would say potentially taking an artist and do a rendering of that picture with the same physical characteristics. And you can, you can, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to suggest Photoshop, but a different environment or a different background
Mm.
could also be helpful when the time is right to discuss the harder things about that reality. That has to be done, but I do think there's a bridge to that can occur with some kind of a different way to depict the individual.
I like that idea. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a great question because I think those are the things that people will find ways to steer out of because of that. And I get it. Like I get it. I mean, I get it. But the reality is that adoption wouldn't exist but for some really hard things happening. So if we can't at least sit with some of that acknowledgement, like going in, and we haven't done that very much. So we're usually in it and then having to acknowledge some of that. And we haven't prepared ourselves for it. So a lot of families today are kind of like, oh man, they didn't tell us that at the adoption agency. Oh, what are we going to do? So, but now we're in that, like we're unpacking some stuff. But the idea would be to kind of help parents do that while they're in the flow of even deciding if adoption's right for them,
Mhm.
because that's the level, that's the bar, that's what we're working towards versus steering directly out of that. Yeah. Because what we don't want is a kid to find that mugshot, because they will. I mean, look,
Mhm.
it's not 9 times out of 10, whether we want to believe it or not, and we think, oh, my kid just so into us as a family that they won't ever want to care about that. Go ahead, think that. But the truth is, someone along the path themselves, or someone's going to encourage them. Oh, don't you want to find? And maybe they do, maybe they don't. And then they see a mugshot and be like, Mom, Dad, who's that? And that my dad's in jail. What? Like you don't want to be revisiting that or visiting it for the first time in a crisis moment.
Yes, agree. Hey guys, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can try that again. I do think we're coming up on our end time, aren't we? Oh, it is 1:29.
Yeah, it's crazy. It goes by so fast. But you know what? I'm around. I'm around. You can find me on social media too. So if anybody had questions that you didn't have answered here or something comes up, please always, just reach out. I'm happy to hear from you. It's just easy. Social media stuff, just pop me a DM and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But Rachel, always a joy. You're so warmly welcoming of me, and that has been really amazing. And I'm grateful for it. And well, for all y'all who've been listening and in conversation in one way or another, appreciate you and hope to see you again in some way, shape, or form.
And thank you for your generous offer of reaching out. And I'm sure I will again and encourage other people too. And hey, folks, we will get your certificates out if you'd like to share with your agency that you participated. We'll get the recording out and I'm going to pop my email in the chat. But thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again, April.
Appreciate you, Rachel. Take care, y'all.